Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the third panel of our conference. This third panel is entitled The Birth of the New Poland and deals with the period from 1989 to mainly 1992. We got great panelists. I'm really honored to be able and to have a privilege to chair this panel. Our first panelist is Dr. Fritz Bartel, a historian of global politics and political economy in the late 20th century. His work centered on the end of the Cold War, the rise of neoliberalism, global financial and energy markets, and the comparative history of democratic capitalism and state socialism. He's currently an assistant professor of international affairs at the Bush School of the Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University. He's an author of the book The Triumph of Broken Promises, The End of the Cold War and the Rise of Neoliberalism, published in 22. But today he will speak about the economic causes of 1989 in Poland. Dear Dr. Bartel, 20 minutes, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Patryk, for that introduction, and thank you, Tomasz, for the kind invitation to join you all here. Take this off so that I don't hear myself. It really is an honor to be here and to hear from and learn from so many people that I've already been learning from over many years, reading various things that you've written, documents you've collected, recollections that you've shared, and to be here and to get to have this conversation, to be a part of these conversations is really an honor for me. So today I'd like to talk about a relatively little known part of the story of the revolutions of 1989, although our conversation so far today has made clear that among this group it's more well known than perhaps among the general public. And that is the economic causes of the political events of that year. I think it's fair to say that most people remember that year as one of profoundly political events that were spurred by political or perhaps ideological causes. Among those being Mikhail Gorbachev's launch of glasnost and perestroika in the Soviet Union, the evaporation of the communists' own confidence in their ideology and system of rule, and perhaps most importantly, the quote-unquote people power of citizens taking to the streets to demand change. Even 1989's very best chroniclers have a blind spot around the economic dimensions of that year. As Timothy Garton Ash has written, quote, unlike Poland in 1980, it was not a turn of the economic screw that precipitated mass protest in any Eastern European country in 1989. Today I'd like to remind us, though, that there were indeed very profound economic causes behind the stunning collapse of communism and the end of the Cold War. Poland's 1989, as well as the broader collapse of the communist bloc that occurred in that year, did have important economic antecedents, ones that stretch back to the early 1970s and place Poland's history and the history of the communist bloc firmly within the foundational transformations of the global economy that occurred in the late 20th century. Those transformations largely occurred in the areas of energy, specifically oil and natural gas, and finance. And so it's on these areas of energy and finance that we must focus. And once we do, I hope it will become clear that developments on global capital and energy markets exerted a very strong influence on the relatively peaceful demise of the communist bloc and the rise of the first solidarity government here in Poland. To put the bottom line of my argument up front, by the late 1980s, global capital and energy markets placed immense pressure on communist states to impose austerity on their own populations. And having dealt with years of social unrest triggered by price increases, Wojciech Jaruzelski and his leading cadre decided in 1988 and 1989 that economic austerity would only be possible if it received the broad support of Polish society through limited political liberalization. This led in turn to the Round Table, the June elections, the first solidarity government, and more generally, the fall of communism and the end of the Cold War. So a historian can pick many dates to begin a historical explanation of the demise of communism in Poland. 1970, 1976, 1980, or 1988 are usually the leading candidates. 1973, however, does not usually garner attention. But I think it should, because it was in that year that the price of oil on world markets quadrupled from roughly $3 to $12 a barrel. Coming on the heels of the collapse of the Bretton Woods system in 1971, which untethered US dollars from the price of gold and flooded the global economy with these dollars, this price explosion had important effects on every country in the world due to the centrality of oil to the economies of both capitalism and communism. For the industrialized states of the West, the price shock worsened inflation, caused the most significant recession since the Great Depression, and generally worsened the crisis of the prevailing Keynesian model of macroeconomic governance. Observers in the West began to speak of a quote-unquote crisis of governability in democracies. For oil-producing states, like those in the Gulf, and importantly the Soviet Union, the price shock arrived as a windfall to their national coffers. Previous economic problems like food shortages or a lack of Western technology could now be papered over with oil wealth. After 1973, oil and gas became the material basis of Soviet power in the world. For oil importing countries, like those of the global South, the price shock caused a significant rise in import bills and consequently sovereign debt, debt which would go on to cause the so-called Third World Debt Crisis and many political revolutions in the 1980s. A country like communist Poland initially seemed to be immune from these shocks that rocked the world economy in the 1970s. After all, it had secure and cheap energy supplies, both at home and from the Soviet Union. It had fixed prices and thus no apparent inflation. It had an authoritarian system of government that appeared to make leaders like Edvard Gierek immune from the popular pressures that seemed to be crippling democratically elected leaders in the West. But this immunity from the pressures of the global economy was in fact a temporary illusion, one that was based on the country's uniquely preferential access to energy and financial resources. First, in the area of oil and natural gas, the 1973 oil crisis turned the communist bloc into a massive economic burden on the Kremlin. Every barrel of oil or cubic meter of gas sold to communist countries at low fixed prices was now sold at a substantial loss to the Soviet Union and could not be used to cover Moscow's growing needs in agriculture, technology, and consumer goods. From the moment the oil crisis struck, Soviet leaders were aware of this new burden and did what they could to rectify it. But they also knew that if they raised prices within interbloc trade, bloc governments would have to impose austerity domestically in order to create the export surpluses required to pay Moscow's higher prices. This, everyone knew, would be a recipe for popular revolt. And so the Kremlin leadership tried to find a stable middle ground between their rapidly evolving economic interests and the political stability of the bloc. In 1975, they introduced a new price system into Comecon trade, one that based the price of energy on a rolling average of the previous 5 years of world market prices. This left bloc energy prices well below world market levels, but rising nevertheless. The stability of communist economies, including Poland, now relied on the continuation of relatively cheap Soviet energy at subsidized prices, subsidies that cost Moscow billions of dollars over the course of the 1970s and 1980s. So if energy provided one pillar of Poland's privileged position in the global economy in the 1970s, finance provided the other. As we've already heard from a number of people, Poland had special access to finance based partially in governments, and it used this access to mitigate some of the effects of the oil crisis. Right? Among many of its effects, the oil crisis exploded the size of global capital markets as oil-producing states placed their massive windfalls on deposit in Western banks. And now, awash in liquidity, the world's financial markets became a sort of financial Wild West in the 1970s, and a cheap source of capital for governments looking to borrow money in order to pad their domestic popularity. Surprisingly, Western banks in the 1970s believed that communist countries like Poland were the best place to put their money, or their clients' money, for exactly the reasons I've mentioned. Poland had abundant energy, no inflation, and authoritarianism. Edvard Gierek and his ministers used the capitalist confidence of this decade to unleash a borrowing and spending spree. And Poland's debt exploded from, as we've already heard, roughly $900 million in 1970 to $23.5 billion in 1980. But the good times could only last as long as the country maintained its privileged access to energy and finance. And in late 1979, that access evaporated very quickly when the chairman of the US Federal Reserve, Paul Volcker, began what became known as the Volcker shock to US dollar interest rates. Suddenly, with dollar interest rates hovering around 20%, sovereign debt burdens like Warsaw's looked extremely unmanageable to Western bankers, and they stopped extending new loans. All of us in this room know very well what happened next. In the summer of 1980, for the third time in a decade, the Polish government attempted to impose domestic austerity by raising consumer prices, which in turn quickly gave rise to solidarity. For the rest of the 1980s, Poland's sovereign debt continued to grow as it was continuously rescheduled, reaching something like $39 or $40 billion by 1989. But the country never regained the confidence of global capital markets because of its inability to impose sufficient austerity, create export surpluses, and service its debt. And with capitalist confidence shattered, Poland did not receive, as I think someone's already mentioned today, did not receive a new dollar of Western finance from 1981 until 1989. Instead of providing new money, Western governments and capitalist banks waited for events on the ground here in Warsaw and around the country to conform to their demands. And we've heard about that kind of conditionality a great deal already today. These demands, I would say, were in fact largely, or first and foremost, economic and secondarily political. And this depends on which institution you're looking at it from. Many of the institutions in the US government were certainly focused on political conditionality. But that was always paired with this demand to work with and eventually meet the demands of the International Monetary Fund. And it was the International Monetary Fund which would actually impose the austerity and the structural adjustment that was demanded. So Poland had to carry out significant domestic economic reform in order to rejoin the IMF. Jaruzelski's general amnesty of political prisoners in September 1986 was in large measure driven by a desire to regain the favor of foreign capital. But the real work of conforming to the IMF's demands began after Poland officially rejoined the organization in June of 1986. These efforts to meet the demands of global capital, institutionally embodied in the IMF, shaped the demise of communism in Poland in decisive ways. So in order to be brief, let me just briefly sketch out three specific instances in which these demands of foreign capital played an important role. First, the November 1987 referendum on economic and political reform marks in some ways the beginning of communism's final chapter in Poland. And Jaruzelski's decision to call it was directly motivated by his desire to gain popular acceptance of austerity, and in turn, the IMF's blessing and debt relief from the West. In a meeting with fund representatives in the lead up to the referendum, a Polish financial official told the IMF that the referendum would, quote, muster support for economic reform and austerity measures, and that the timing of it was, quote, influenced by hopes of a program with the fund. This was, of course, not to be. The party famously lost the referendum, and its subsequent decision to press ahead with real wage cuts, despite the absence of a popular mandate, directly led to the strikes of April and August of 1988 that played a central role in bringing the party leadership to the negotiating table with solidarity. And once they arrived at that table in Magdalenka in September 1988 for their first meeting with the Union, the communist leadership made the purpose of the roundtable crystal clear. As Kiszczak told Wałęsa in their first meeting, the authorities were open to the roundtable because it could, quote, respond to and eventually correct the economic model and resolve, these were his words, resolve the debt issue. He continued, quote, the success of the economic reform program depends upon its understanding and social acceptance, as he framed it. Therefore, trading political liberalization for society's acceptance of austerity and painful economic reform in order to regain the favor of foreign creditors had become the logic driving events forward. But just because this logic was powerful, that did not mean that everyone in the communist leadership embraced it, particularly when it came to including the daunting prospect of re-legalizing solidarity. In January 1989, the Central Committee in this very building roundly criticized Jaruzelski when he presented the idea of legalizing, as the party called it, legalizing solidarity and starting roundtable negotiations. In response, the general and his closest advisors threatened to resign and stormed out of the room. And once cooler heads had prevailed and Jaruzelski had returned to the chamber, he laid out his reasons for supporting this unpalatable step. First, the roundtable would buy the government a period of social peace. Second, it would enhance the party's legitimacy by increasing popular participation in the upcoming elections. And third, and importantly, it would unlock the Western economic aid. Without the West's funds, he said, quote, we will be unable to jumpstart the economy. It's simply out of the question, and it may even get worse. Unable to resist Jaruzelski's logic, the Central Committee approved the plan to legalize solidarity and opened the roundtable. And within 8 months, of course, Poland had its first non-communist prime minister since the start of the Cold War. So you may be asking yourselves the question that everyone in 1988 and 1989 was asking. Why wasn't the Kremlin stopping this implosion of one of its most important allies from happening? And the shorter answer is, it was too costly. Ever since the 1973 oil crisis, the Soviet leadership in Moscow had complained about the costs of its empire, and they had looked for ways to extract themselves from that burden without inciting destabilizing social backlashes in their allies' societies. We often think of Mikhail Gorbachev as an extraordinary idealist, and indeed, in many ways, he was. But when it came to the economic burden of socialist brotherhood, he was ruthlessly mercenary in his calculations. As he told the Politburo on August 14, 1986, the Soviet Union's leadership role left the country, quote, harnessed into slave labor, extracting raw materials and supplying them to other countries. He had no illusions about the causes of the socialist bloc's apparent economic stability and success in the 1970s. When discussing Gieryk's legacy with the Soviet Politburo in 1988, he rhetorically asked, quote, what was it all based on? And the answer to him was obvious. Quote, on credits from the West and on our cheap fuel, he told his comrades. This could not continue. Quote, we cannot remain a provider of cheap resources for them forever, he said. As much as energy had helped the Soviet Union in the 1970s after the oil price shock, it now hurt Moscow after the fall in oil prices in late 1985. The Kremlin lost an estimated $24 billion in export revenue from 1985 to 1988, money that it had to compensate for by cutting back at home and abroad. And this left Gorbachev and his team with very few options for influencing the course of events in Warsaw. A message that his deputy, Georgy Shakhnazarov, relayed to the Polish leadership during those fateful summer months of 1988. If it came to a situation like the Polish crisis of the early 1980s, Shakhnazarov said, quote, we would not intervene. If solidarity took power, Shakhnazarov stated, Poland would probably take on a status close to, as he called it, Finlandization. The USSR would have to accept that. The loss of Soviet backing, particularly, of course, military backing, was the last key domino that fell on the way to the Polish communists' embrace of roundtable negotiations and the reemergence of solidarity. And that removal of Soviet support had much less to do with Gorbachev's highest ideals and much more to do with his material calculations than scholars and the public at large remember. Those calculations were driven, above all, by energy and finance. Thus, we can see, I hope, how economic pressures emanating from global financial and energy markets were essential causes in the collapse of the communist bloc and the return of solidarity through democratic means. Democratic reform arrived as a means of imposing economic austerity, and this austerity was the price that global finance required for a debtor country to return to its good graces. General Jaruzelski found himself facing the familiar challenge of anti-democratic leaders, subject to the demands of the IMF. And that challenge was to legitimize austerity in a political system that had no legitimacy. Regaining legitimacy through the machinery of electoral democracy was therefore essential. As Jaruzelski later concluded, quote, "The necessary social support for economic reform could be granted only in a system of parliamentary democracy. Only such a system," he said, "could carry the burden of unpopular decisions." Thanks very much. I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you, Dr. Bartel, for this synthesizing, insightful presentation and great time discipline. Teraz, proszę Państwa, przechodzimy do drugiego
Now it's
punktu,
time to move on to the second point on on the agenda of our panel, the second panelist.
Kolejność chronologiczną.
So we will use the time perspective. So I will ask the main organizer of our conference, not the only one, because Sylwia Szyc is worth mentioning, but also, so I mean, here I mean Dr. Tomasz Kozłowski. He's a historian and political scientist. He works at the Historical Research Bureau of the Institute of National Remembrance. He is assistant professor at the Polish Academy of Sciences. He specializes in the history of solidarity and mainly on the political transformation in Poland, not only in 1989 and he is the author of many books. The most important ones to me and my research is the book published in 2019, The End of Ministry of Interior Empire. Now he conducts research into Polish-American relations during the period of transformation. He will he will read a 20-minute paper entitled "Waiting for Balcerowicz: The Impact of International Situation on Economic Transformation in Poland in 1989. Dr. Tomek, the floor is yours.
Dziękuję bardzo. Ja w swoim wystąpieniu będę kontynuował niektóre wątki.
Thank you very much. My paper will continue some of the threads that were just touched upon by Fritz Bartel. And I would like to take this opportunity to congratulate you on your last book, The Triumph of Broken Promises. It's an excellent book and it's worth recommending to all of you. So, continuing the final thread from your paper, it should be emphasized that change came from the East. In the early 1980s, the Soviet economy found itself in such bad condition that it was only kept alive by the sale of oil on international markets. And so when oil prices began to fall, it turned out there was no more money in the budget and you would have to do reforms. The biggest spending went towards the army and weapons, and here Gorbachev opened a diplomatic front to de-escalate the conflict with the states, but he also asked what's next for Eastern Europe, and he explained to his colleagues from the Soviet Politburo, a range of socialist countries have fallen into debt. They are living off of loans at the cost of our oil. So the biggest problem was Poland, which had a debt of $40 billion in the West. When in 1986, one of Gorbachev's collaborators told Gorbachev that Poland is dangerously drifting towards the West, Gorbachev replied, "We complain about the Poles' relationship with the IMF, but what are they to do? What else are they to do? They are in debt." And in 1988, when talking to his comrades about the fact that trade will not successfully keep Poland and Hungary within the orbit of the USSR, he explained, "We look at them questioningly as they drift away towards the West, but there's nothing we can do about it." It seems that Gorbachev made a red line of reforms that included participation in the Warsaw Pact and the Comic-Con. The rest was anything that fit within these boundaries was allowed, and Gorbachev sort of looked away. American diplomacy quickly saw this, and as George Shultz noted, Secretary of State, I asked to meet with the Poles to encourage them to make internal changes that would move them away from the Soviets, and the Poles were interested, and of course Jaruzelski was interested. However, at the same time, during meetings of the Polish Politburo, he would warn his colleagues about what American policy was about. It is about emphasizing the identity of socialist countries that no longer have to obey Moscow. And he requested caution. The problem was that Poland was on the verge of bankruptcy and another social revolt. It needed support and loans from the international community. The White House took advantage of the situation. As everyone was aware, Mieczysław Rakowski, who became prime minister in 1988, explained this America's betting on Hungary and Poland is not accidental because they simply considered these to be almost ripe fruit that will soon fall off of the socialist tree. So as we have mentioned several times today, George H.W. Bush was engaged starting in 83 and 87 in the policy of drawing Poland toward the West, and when he was sworn in as president in 1989, he was faithful to that policy. He understood this region, its challenges, and I also think he had great hopes when looking at Poland. And indeed, like we said, in the fall of 1988, the communists start talking to Solidarity representatives. The roundtable talks begin in April. Elections are scheduled for June. Both the communist government and Solidarity are convinced that these elections would help preserve a kind of status quo. So neither the communists will win decisively, nor will Solidarity prevail. Both sides were wrong. Solidarity won this plebiscite of sorts, and it would seem that that should provoke a reaction from the Kremlin. But nothing of that sort happened because Poland did not approach the thin red line. It did not cease being part of the Warsaw Pact and the Comic-Con. And so the advisor to the U.S. president noted this. The Soviet reaction is very toned down. Maybe Moscow doesn't know the limits of its tolerance yet. Gorbachev and some members of his team have quite a lot in common with the Polish and Hungarian reformers dangerous, and it's hard to censure them for taking steps that he himself had encouraged. Eastern Europeans must accept that there is political opposition if they are to embark on economic reforms. So this is a key issue. The White House sees the need for daring reforms in Poland to repair the country's economic situation. Moreover, after the June elections, the economy is behind. The situation is deteriorating. There is growing, skyrocketing inflation after Rakowski's failed reforms. There is debt, and it's hard to square the circle. So the reforms are late in coming because nobody wants to lend money to Poland. On the other hand, nobody is lending money to Poland because there is a fear that if Jaruzelski starts introducing reforms, there will be social turmoil and his team, his cabinet might get swept away. So during his visit, mentioned here many times, Bush's visit in July '89, the president promised limited support, at the same time calling upon Poles to undertake painful reforms. And this aspect of history has sort of faded into the background, but it was that, at that time, during those weeks, that was more important to Washington than political issues, especially after the Tiananmen Square massacre. Secretary of State Baker explained, I quote, "While in China economic reforms are ahead of political change, the situation is the reverse in Eastern Europe, in Hungary and Poland. There have been significant political reforms, but especially in Poland, there has not been a significant economic reform." In Baker's view, it was essential to make everyone, and the communists included, realize how needed these economic reforms were. Crawford also said that there was a contrast in Poland between political awakening and the deteriorating economic situation. Moreover, the opposition, Solidarity, was less inclined to undertake market reform than the communists were. During one meeting, Wałęsa explained to Bush that the Polish communists are like radishes. They are only red on the outside. Their communism, their ideology is a facade. Because if we consider that a communist is somebody that calls for the abolition of private property and defends a centrally managed economy, then we could say that in 1989, there were no longer any communists in the Politburo or the Polish government. Jaruzelski personally convinced Bush that he would undertake market reforms. He promised attaining market balance, eliminating ineffectual production and subsidies. Jaruzelski was ready to pay the price of the reform, the introduction of competition, the closure of ineffectual plants, unemployment, and other austerity measures. Jaruzelski was also convinced that for the sake of reform, Poland would need support from the West and pressure from the West. He even asked Bush if he could intervene with the head of the IMF to get this man to come to Poland and go on TV to explain to the Poles why these painful reforms were necessary. Jaruzelski's team needed new loans in order to to restructure those they already had. And all the Western countries made one condition: the government had to agree to a recovery program with the IMF. This is the same thing that Rakowski's government was told in London, Washington, Paris, or Bonn. Where did did this demand come from? Well, the IMF was considered an institution that understood the Polish economy and knew which reforms had to be introduced in order to rescue the country. So accepting approval for the recovery program from the IMF was a guarantee that the new loans would not be wasted, would not go to waste. And Rakowski's government already had a plan prepared, which it wasn't exactly a socialist or communist plan, as it included liberalizing the economy, privatization, including creating a stock exchange and shareholder companies, fighting inflation by stopping the growth of real income, the elimination of ineffectual factories, plants, or even whole branches of the economy. And Wilczek asked his government colleagues how much longer they would have to hide the essence of the planned reforms under the guise of a story about a socialist market economy. He explained to his colleagues, I quote, "There's one market, the market is one, and there are no miracles." And he also said that sooner or later we would have to tell society that we are building capitalism with a human face. The communists were preparing to leap into a market. They were preparing shock therapy of sorts. If history had turned out differently, then Rakowski and Sekuła plus Jaruzelski may have gone down in history as the founders of a capitalist economy, market economy in Poland. The communists were convinced there was no alternative. A deputy prime minister Sekuła, responsible for the economy, said that even if the Rakowski government falls, the program to liberalize the economy would be implemented by our successors, because there is no other way unless we want to be stuck in the third world and slide towards being the fourth world. And so the following government took this painful path of market reform, the government of Mazowiecki and Deputy Prime Minister Leszek Balcerowicz. And when in June '89 Balcerowicz visited Washington, he had talks at the IMF, at the White House, at the Department of State. Afterwards, the Department of State sent a cable to the American Embassy in Warsaw, which could be summarized to its opening sentence: Balcerowicz was a hit. President Bush, in early October, familiarized himself with Crawford's assessment. I quote, "All polls now seem ready to implement a rigorous program of economic reforms, and they intend to conclude negotiations with the IMF by the end of the year. Poland has attained a critical stage in the process of economic and political reforms. The Polish leadership has decided that it must introduce radical shock reforms right now during the political honeymoon of Mazowiecki's government with Polish society." So that is what the White House expected. So essentially all the plans came true, and even more. Not only was democratic reform introduced in Poland, but also economic reforms, market reforms that were able to keep up with political changes. It must be noted that in the final Cold War game, the White House truly made a powerful maneuver against its political opponent by using the same tactics or exploiting the weakness of the opponent, who was in debt, and basically waited for the communists to give up. It was like a double Nelson, a full Nelson on Jaruzelski. On the one hand, support for solidarity and democracy, while also subjecting Jaruzelski's government to economic pressures in order to force economic reforms, because both transformations were simultaneous. They seem to be the same thing. However, it's June 4th, 1989, at the elections, whose 35th anniversary we are celebrating today. It's those elections that showed how much of an influence Polish society had. History could have gone otherwise if Poles had not stood behind solidarity in the elections. If Jaruzelski and Rakowski had been strong enough, they may have created a market economy in Poland, because the shape of Poland's economic transformation was as much a result of the beliefs of Leszek Balcerowicz and his collaborators. It was also linked to international considerations, and that is my conclusion. Thank you very much.
Bardzo dziękuję za ten równie
Thank you so much for this inspiring paper.
Wiadomo, o co chodzi, chodzi o pieniądze.
So when you don't know what you are talking about, we are talking about money. Also in politics. So I believe we will not stray away from the financial perspective, but the next two papers focus on a broader time perspective. But also in the previous papers, we have seen the historical background, so maybe I'm not right to say so. However, we are moving towards the 1990s in the next two papers. At least I'm hoping so it will happen. So now I will give the floor to Professor Antoni Dudek, political scientist, YouTuber, and professor of Cardinal Stefan Wyszynski University in Warsaw, whose research interests focus around the history of the People's Republic of Poland and political transformation, and the history of the Third Republic of Poland, author of many valuable articles, and my favorite book is called Reglamentowana Rewolucja, The Fall of the Communist Rule in 1989-90. He is the author of the most popular historical book recently in Poland, so the political history of Poland, 1989-2023. And today, during the next 20 minutes, he will talk about the policy of Polish governments towards the USA in the years 1989 and 1993. Sir, the floor is yours. Thank you so much. I'm very pleased to welcome you. Thank you for having me here. I have learned a lot of interesting insights, and let me start with a quote from a diplomatic cable from Ambassador Davis, who has been referred to a couple of times before. So he was the US ambassador to Poland, who on the 24th of August 1989 has sent a cable to the Department of State that Polish Sejm has elected the Prime Minister, Tadeusz Mazowiecki, and finishing this cable, he said, I quote, "In this situation, I believe that I have delivered on my task presented in the instruction, so I'm waiting for further instructions." So on the same day, he received a cable from the Department of State, Deputy Secretary of State, who also has been mentioned here. He said, and this quote is very important for my presentation, Egelburger wrote to Davis, "Your next task is to support economic reforms in Poland, full employment, low inflation, high productivity, and a Mercedes or its counterpart in every Polish garage." So I believe this task has not been fulfilled. Yes, not everyone Polish house has a Mercedes or or its equivalent, but you cannot doubt that Poland has made a great progress over the past 35 years. And you can see quite a number of Mercedes cars in Polish households. Obviously, the beginnings were quite challenging, and Dr. Kozłowski was talking about it. Poland was not only a country with planned and command ineffective economy. In fact, it was a leader in inefficiency. Undoubtedly, it was a leader in 1989. It was the most bankrupt country in the Eastern Bloc. So the first task faced by Tadeusz Mazowiecki's government was to start the economic reform, and here Leszek Balcerowicz comes to the stage. And the first clear American support is related to the famous Stabilization Fund, which was $1 billion US. So this fund had more than 20 members, but the US and Germany give 50% of this fund, and this enormous fund is a part of the anti-inflation program. And it must be said clearly that American involvement and commitment as compared to the Western countries which lagged behind with payments to the fund, it was really the first help offered by Bush administration to Polish government. And very soon, in the policy of Mazowiecki's government, political issues emerged, which resulted from an international situation resulting from the fall of the Berlin Wall and the reunification of Germany and the question of the western border of Poland. So, if you look at the visit of Mazowiecki to the US in March 1990, and his first meeting with Bush, it seems that economic matters were of secondary importance during that meeting, but the first question was the demand of Tadeusz Mazowiecki that U.S. puts pressure on Chancellor Kohl that before the reunification of Germany, he would confirm a Polish-German border, and Kohl didn't want to agree to that because of internal policy requirements. However, Mazowiecki, which I think was not right to do so, he had some reasons to think so, and he suspected that Kohl didn't want to admit that, maybe was aiming at some revision of Polish-German border. So, because Bush was adamant on this topic, and he supported the Germany, so there was a big clash here. And the second clash concerned the second issue of geopolitical nature. President Bush was surprised why Tadeusz Mazowiecki's government, unlike the government of Czechoslovakia and Hungary, didn't discuss the topic of the military presence, Soviet military presence in the country. Mazowiecki said that the military presence of Russians in Poland guarantee the stability of Polish-German border. So this was the only clash which happily was solved after a couple of months because the Germany was reunited, and one of the first agreements Germany signed was a treaty with Poland, which recognized Polish-German border along the Oder River. But this was the first clash. However, the relationship was developing in different aspects, because Mazowiecki himself talked to Bush in 1990 on 2 occasions. And in Warsaw, other representatives of US government came to Poland. So in April 1990, we had the visit of James Baker, Secretary of State, and in December, Secretary for Defense Dick Cheney. But before Cheney, in November 1990, William Webster, the head of CIA, came to Poland to present medals to a group of high-ranking officers of Polish intelligence service. So this was a new secret service in Poland to thank for the role Polish intelligence played for the evacuation of American diplomats from Baghdad. And I believe this operation was a symbolic beginning of special forces of Poland and the US, because I do not recall previous cooperation, and it resulted from the talks of spring 1989 between special services in Poland and the US. So I believe this is the first foundation for further cooperation in other areas, because in 1990 we saw, as part of the development of cooperation, so exchanges of officials. So more than 100 Polish officials came to US for training. So I believe this is something that we need research into. So General who obtained a distinction from Webster, he believed that the training in the US, especially the training for special forces officials, training was offered by retired Iranian officers. So this is a very interesting information, which shows that 1990 marked the start, the orientation of Polish administration from the east to the west, so from the Soviet Union to the United States. And I believe that an important element is the question of the construct of the intelligence service for the Polish government. As we can say, the secret police so the officials were verified in 1990, so it was Department 1 or intelligence. Only 2 officers were verified negatively at that time, but from the reports by General Czempiński, we can say that the Americans gave Poles a list of other officers of communist intelligence who they didn't want to see in the new forces, because they believed they served Moscow, and to the best of my knowledge they were not offered positions in the intelligence department of new government, although they were not officially recognized as Russian spies. So this is something that needs to be researched or verified. So going on to another aspect, it seems that the government of Tadeusz Mazowiecki paradoxically didn't pay enough attention to the relationship with the US, which was proven by the very position of a Polish ambassador to the US, because it was only in August, so almost a year after the appointment of Mazowiecki's government, a new ambassador was appointed. So Jan Kinasta was replaced by colleague of Tadeusz Mazowiecki, journalist Kazimierz Dziewanowski. So this was the start of Polish diplomatic efforts in the US, the new phase of diplomatic démarche in the US. So the second Polish government, which was formed in 91, so the government of Jan Krzysztof Bielecki marked a new chapter in Polish-American relationship. So I believe the U.S. has somehow contributed to the formation of its government. So first of all, we had first presidential elections, free presidential elections in Poland, which were held in November and December 1990. As we all know, Lech Wałęsa was elected the president, and because Mazowiecki was a candidate and lost in these elections, he resigned as a prime minister, and Bielecki was given the position of prime minister and the task to form a new government. And apparently the US suggested to President Wałęsa that Professor Balcerowicz still should play an important role in this government to make sure that the market reforms are continued. And he was offered to become a prime minister by Lech Wałęsa, but he wanted to serve as a deputy prime minister, and Jan Krzysztof Bielecki became the prime minister.
And here again, because I don't have so much time left, during the first phase of the Bielecki government, the most important issue in which the Americans played a part was the reduction of the Polish debt. The negotiations are ongoing, but in March 91, there's a critical moment when it comes to how much to reduce the debt by, and Poland plays a tough game. They start by proposing to reduce the debt by 80%. Of course, that's unattainable. However, with very clear American support, they come to a 50% reduction. And here, the American Deputy Treasury Minister David Mulford plays an important part. He apparently also convinced Japan to accept this debt reduction. And in this context, I would like to quote part of a statement by a man whose name I didn't mention here, the man who brings all those four governments together, starting with the Mazowiecki government through the Bielecki government, Olszewski's government, and finally Suchocka's. In all of these governments, the head of diplomacy, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, was Professor Krzysztof Skubiszewski. So this is an element of continuity in Polish foreign policy for the West. So in March 91, Skubiszewski says the following sentence at a government meeting in the context of the news coming in about the breakthrough in negotiations about reducing Poland's debt. And it's quite interesting because he names a number of quite exotic elements here with regard to Polish-American collaboration in foreign affairs. Skubiszewski says, if we didn't have a policy with regard to the U.S. like we do, including contentious issues like human rights in Cuba, if we hadn't taken an unequivocal position with regard to Panama, if we had not supported their policy vis-à-vis Iraq starting on August 2nd, and that refers to the Gulf War, then if we had not done all this, then our relations with the States would have been different, apparently worse. And that would have impacted our policy with regard to the great economic problems, especially the issue of debt. So, translating that statement into a simpler language, you can see clearly that Poland, starting in different areas, through the Iraq issue, through Latin America, is starting to support American efforts on the global arena, and this led to America rewarding Poland by supporting Poland with regard to debt reduction. So that is a practical example of how Polish diplomacy, for over 3 decades, they had been welded with the Soviet center, always following the dictates of the Kremlin. They're now starting to coordinate their moves with the Americans, with American diplomacy. An important event that opens a new stage and a new problem in Polish-American relations involved 2 events from '91. So one is the final dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, and then that was July, and the Moscow Putsch in August, which fortunately did not succeed. However, it makes it clear both to the political elite in Poland and to certain circles in the States that this part of Europe, that includes Poland, is starting to be part of a gray zone of uncertainty. The Warsaw Pact is no longer in existence. No one knows what the future of the USSR is going to be, and this makes Bielecki, during a visit to the States in September '91, it makes him formulate for the first time the suggestion or the demand to accept Poland, and not just Poland, but all of Central Europe, to admit them to NATO. So that was the first move made by a Polish politician in that regard. But at the same time, Bielecki meets with Bush, and the American reaction is nil. There is no reaction. So you see clearly when you read the memo from this meeting, and Bielecki confirmed this, the Americans don't really react. They say, you can count on us when it comes to economic reforms, but NATO is a no-go. And the Bush administration will remain faithful to that assumption until the end, even though the next government, that of Jan Olszewski, will put the issue of Poland's membership in NATO forward with force. Nonetheless, Olszewski's visit in April '92 was a failure in terms of securing Poland's membership in NATO. The Americans realized that this government was in conflict with President Wałęsa, and for the Americans, Wałęsa was the main partner rather than the often changing governments in Poland. And my final point is that the last Polish government, that of Hanna Suchocka, or the last that I was going to talk about, Prime Minister Suchocka was the only prime minister who didn't visit the States, which doesn't mean that contacts deteriorated. It was Bush who came in July '92 to Poland yet again, and here we see that although one of the versions of the speech he had prepared, this is what Roland Asmuth claims in his book about Poland's road to NATO. So although Bush had a speech that he had prepared in which he was going to declare that the States would support Poland's candidacy for NATO, ultimately, pressured by his advisors, he backed out of that, and no such words were spoken by Bush. However, there was an official declaration by Suchocka in October '92 during her visit to the NATO headquarters in Brussels. She maintained Bielecki's and Olszewski's declaration that Poland does indeed want to be part of NATO. So this issue of Polish accession to NATO was inherited by the Clinton administration, and it was was this administration that ultimately made a positive decision about this matter, but that is a subject for another paper. So, in my view, although this process of rapprochement between Poland and the States ultimately only ended in 1999 when Poland joined NATO. In my view, the foundations for this process across many fields that require further research, the foundations were built starting in 1989 until 1993, as seen in the fact that when in 93 the Polish that the post-communists rose to power in Poland, there were no significant changes in the pro-Atlantic and pro-Western course. So the three post-communist coalition governments continued on the same path.
Bardzo dziękuję za fascynujące
Thank you for this fascinating presentation. And now, last but not least, our fourth speaker, concluding this round, concluding our papers, which will be followed by a discussion, is Professor Grzegorz Górski, lawyer, lecturer, attorney, former judge in the State Tribunal, specializing in Poland's recent history and the history of Poland's political system and law after 1918. He is also a historian of American law and British law. His paper will focus on the beginnings of Poland's road to NATO, so it's going to be a logical continuation of the things touched upon in the previous paper, and he will also introduce us to the history of Jaruzelski's government, and he will talk about the official withdrawal of Soviet troops from Poland in early '92. Professor, you have 20 minutes. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation to take part in this event. This is a very important time of reflection, so it is around every 5 years that we celebrate that date of 1989. So a number of issues have already been elaborated on, and I'm going to skip them. If you'll allow me, I'll make a few points that weren't touched upon. So, first of all, one thing that we can say in hindsight, because we live in a time that is also witnessing a certain reconstruction, reconfiguration of the political system in Europe. We can say that 1989 opened the way to the construction of a new international system, new in the sense that it ushered in the questioning of the Yalta agreements, but also the way in which the Yalta agreements had been executed or implemented, ultimately confirmed by the Helsinki Charter. So that road was open. So when the roundtable talks began in February and in December, we saw the dramatic events in Romania, that whole structure that had arisen in 1945, created in 45-46 and partly 47, that simply collapsed, although not everyone was aware of that fact yet. And surprisingly, not just on the Polish side, where this could be understood in the context of the big problems and challenges that were mentioned here, the huge economic crisis, the social problems, the awareness that the country would have to be And it also shows, we see this in the quote from Eigelberger's instruction. He said that what began in Poland was limited in scope. If that had been a statement by a journalist or a statement in an interview, it would have been negible. However, that was a rather secret instruction and a sort of formulation of policy as we witnessed profound and dramatic changes. So another reflection regarding how how unpredictable the situation was. And I agree with the claim made earlier that in the plan and in the awareness of the elites running the countries of the Soviet bloc, especially in the minds of the Soviet elites, they were aware that they would need to undertake a certain reconstruction. A reconstruction, at least in Poland and Hungary. However, they were not aware where this would lead, and the consequences were already in evidence by December 1989. And they were unprepared, as also seen in the proof that was quoted this morning about how surprising it was to Chancellor Kohl what happened in Berlin. So the dynamics were so powerful that everybody was essentially helpless in the face of that challenge, helpless and unprepared.
Looking from this perspective, we are much more comfortable today because we have a distance. We can present our thesis that was not made aware of by all the people. Not all people were aware that we had such a big transformation and a historical perspective. So the main two aspects made questions that were of great interest to Polish elites, both the opposition in the country and in the immigration, was the regaining independence by Poland, because Poland was not independent. This is an undeniable fact. And what events could lead to the regaining of the independence was one of the basic questions that were asked, just like it was the case before the outbreak of a Great War. And the second element was if the independence was regained, how to secure it. Because you need to find solutions within the existing context and how to make sure that this independence will be lasting, because at the end of every head, at the back of every head, people knew that this regained independence over the long-term perspective was just an episode. It was only 19-20 years, so it was not a long time. So the question, how to make sure that this independence is lasting, was of key importance. And looking at these two aspects, at these two goals or challenges, we need to be aware that in order to make sure that the independence is lasting, first of all, it must be regained, and the relationship with the USSR was here extremely important. And let me remind you that from the beginning of the 18th century, Soviet troops stayed in Poland, and the a short period of our absence from August 1915 until September 1939 or later 44. So this was the main challenge. So we were wondering whether we could regain independence, whereas Russian troops were stationing in Poland. And at that time, we had 70,000 Russian soldiers in Poland. And there was also a contingent, Russian contingent in the Democratic German Republic. So these questions were not only asked in Poland, but as it was mentioned in the morning, it was also they were also of importance to the US. And the independence was not on the table at the time. Obviously, as the events unfold, the approaches changed. And even until today, in public debate, we are talking about regaining independence. So these divisions and different ideas have been presented since 1970s by different opposition groups in Poland. So these patriotic movements were quite expressive. We also had people focusing around core Workers' Defense Committee. So even after 1989, the discussion was continued and different views were presented. Also, immigration, people in exile, Poles in exile also had different views. And, you know, this division dated back to the January uprising. So the two standpoints were always present in Poland. And it should be noted that undoubtedly Tadeusz Mazowiecki's government, with all its merits, didn't catch up with reality and changes, because the deep conviction of the then Prime Minister that without the support of the Soviet Union, Polish-German border will not be preserved, had very adverse impact on the Polish stance on the international arena, and has impacted on the opportunities for building future relationship with NATO. Because the question of the presence of Russian troops would re-emerge as a fundamental topic in considering the question of Poland's relationship with NATO. And without solving this problem, it was obvious that no talks were possible or meaningful. And it was clearly visible at the time of reuniting of Germany. And it was of paramount importance not only to Germany, but it was also articulated by President Bush, which made things more difficult later on to move on smoothly to serious talks about Poland's presence in NATO. The second determinant was originated in the Chancellery of the Prime Minister and from President Wałęsa, who propagated NATO peace, which was not understood, and EOG which was not understood neither in Europe nor in the US. And these pioneering efforts of Poles dating back to 1989 and earlier was less prominent because Poland could use the leverage from the 80s to obtain some priority treatment, but these initiatives undermined these maneuvers. And the turning point, as Professor Dudek mentioned, was the Yanayev Putsch, which to American administration was a clear signal that the change is coming inevitably. And from what I heard today, for a very long time, people believed that the dire strait in which Soviet Union found itself in was a result of a very consistent policy of Ronald Reagan, because the internal crisis in the Soviet Union resulting from changing financial conditions in the basic resource owned by the USSR, be it oil and gas. This maneuver was successful and resulted in lowering oil prices by OPEC and the oil-producing countries, and as a result, Soviet economy collapsed. But as it seems, in the light of the documents we have and in the light of what we've heard today, also Americans didn't believe that these measures were so effective, and they underestimated the situation and continued a very cautious policy. And one can risk claiming that they didn't use the opportunities at that time, and this may result in the situation we observe today. And of course, in Polish public debate, we can hear voices, and we should not pretend that they do not exist. So these voices were looking for culprits for today's situation. They digging into a couple of decades ago. But as you can see, there is a broader perspective. And to round up, let me remind you the main thesis of Frederick the Great, that it is coincidence that rules politics. And if we look at this period, 1989-93, building the new reality and the fledgling new architecture, which is the subject of our debate, was in the atmosphere of chaos and changing dynamics to which even the greatest minds couldn't foresee. Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor, for another very interesting insights and observing time. You know, I haven't seen for a long time all the four panelists keeping the time discipline. So as a result, we have ample time for discussion. I strongly encourage you to ask questions, to take the floor. So maybe let us start with Mr. Kowalec. It was very interesting. Thank you so much. And my question relates, is addressed to Tomasz Kozłowski. You've said that Rakowski's government faced the task of carrying out economic reforms. Do you have a specific reform to back it, or is it just based on some sketchy documents? Because to best of my knowledge, there is not a single document proving the market reform. There were certain steps taken, some of them, like Wilczek's Act. This was a very important step which had serious consequences. So as a result, it was a rule that nothing that is forbidden, nothing that is forbidden is not allowed. So the step of the 1st of August 1989 and freeing the food prices, food produce prices, was a radical step, although no macroeconomic backing was present for it, and it caused huge inflation. And talking about privatization or the questions of Polish currency and its conversion, so there were no materials, and so Minister Wróblewski, the Minister of Agriculture, asked Stanisław Gomułka to present some documents concerning the restructuring or the privatization or the introduction of a stock exchange. So there was a question of the formation of public holdings, having shares, so that they could. So it was a stock exchange and a market without private ownership, because these would be public companies that would be noted. Obviously, there were questions of work with International Monetary Funds, but they have never materialized. It was Wojciech Misiąg who was the director of the department, and then was the deputy minister for financial budgets in the government of Mazowiecki and Balcerowicz. We also heard about income tax and VAT tax. So these were the initial works, but no consistent program was seen because some key elements were missing.
Questions. Professor Hutchings? Yeah, you were willing to ask some questions?
Thank you. These are four really fascinating the presentations. I learned a lot. Let me just clarify a couple of points where I had direct involvement. One is on the question of the Polish-German border. So on November 28th, Chancellor Kohl gave his famous 10-point speech about the prospect of German unification. The next day, at the White House, Secretary Baker went to the press room and contradicted Kohl without saying so in so many words on 2 points. One, Kohl failed to mention NATO. So we said we support unequivocally German unification within the context of Poland's continued membership in the EU and the Transatlantic Alliance. The second point was he was silent on the border issue. And having lived in Bavaria for 5 years, I know how sensitive this is domestically for Kohl, that the German expellee community in Bavaria harbored some kind of dreams of maybe recovering lost territory. Kohl didn't necessarily support that, but it's a political matter. He wanted to leave that matter open. He didn't want to offend constituents there. So Baker announced 4 principles in the White House Situation Room, 2 of which contradicted Cole. We supported the observance of the Helsinki principles with respect to borders. It was specifically aimed at the German-Polish border. And we had in the back of our minds that, at least I had in the back of my mind, that no border in East Central Europe predated 1918. So you start reopening the border issue and there's no stopping. The second one was a small amendment to Professor Dudek's comments about the paragraph about NATO membership. So this was a paragraph that was to have gone into the Castle Square speech in July 1992. I drafted it, and we got approval at the level all the way up to Bush, Baker, Scowcroft, and Cheney. That is from all of Baker's key advisors, everyone at the NSC. It was a carefully worded statement that held out the prospect of Poland's fully rejoining Europe in every sense, the European Union. We mentioned NATO. In the end, Bush himself, together with Baker and Scowcroft, decided not to use the paragraph. Not that they didn't believe in it, but it was a very delicate time. The last Soviet troops had not yet left Eastern Europe and Germany. We didn't want to interrupt that. There was turmoil in the Baltic states. And remember, this was July 92. We were getting already rumors of an anti-Gorbachev coup, which actually took place in August. We thought we would do more harm than good by
Gorbachev coup was 91.
Oh yeah, okay. So yeah, you're right, I got the dates wrong. So we were concerned we would do more harm than good. So I wish we'd used the speech, but the paragraph, but we didn't. But it was really the seniors who decided, on balance, we would be making a mistake.
Thank you. Professor Simons? Yes. Yeah, please, Professor.
Yeah. No, I have an anecdote and a question. The anecdote concerns the cooperation between our intelligence services, which Professor Dudek mentioned, and the importance of the exfiltration of our team from Iraq. And Webster was the reward for that, his visit to Warsaw. And he gave a celebration dinner in the villa, which was over generations regarded as an intelligence villa. I think Radkiewicz died there in 1964. It's right around the corner from my residence. And the next night, I gave a reciprocal dinner for the delegation and for our intelligence hosts. And I said to Jempinski, who had been the architect of the Iraq operation, I said, what a kick, what a thrill it was to be in that villa, because I used to walk past, my wife and I used to walk past it every day, but of course we'd never been inside. And he said, well, if you enjoyed that, imagine how I enjoy being in your residence. He said, because I know every corner of it, like the bottom of my pocket, but I've never been inside. My question is for Stefan Kowalec. In addition to your question, my big question is, were you surprised by anything you heard from Dr. Bartel and Dr. Kozłowski in terms of the situation in the Polish economy and in Polish politics in 1988, 1989, 1990? Have you heard anything new that surprised you?
To może zróbmy tak, zaczniemy rzeczywiście od odpowiedzi
What we'll do, we'll start with an answer from Mr. Kowalec, and then we will take the answers from our panelists.
Ja chciałem powiedzieć, że
So this taking note of 1983 as a turning point. 1973, that is quite a new perspective for me. And there's another thing that I spoke to Professor Dudek about once, one point on which we disagreed. Because for me, Mazowiecki's behavior, his actions with regard to the Polish-German border was clear and understandable. So today, if we say that it was unjustified, that's ahistorical, because today we know what happened. For me, if Mazowiecki had not put the border issue firmly, that would have been incomprehensible. It's like when Wałęsa said, we have nothing against the reunification of Germany. You can reunite tomorrow as long as you guarantee our border. Germany's internal problems, cause political problems, are not our problems. Do whatever you want. So if you want us to give our consent for reunification, you have to guarantee the border. So now saying agreeing to Germany's reunification without guaranteeing the border, while demanding that Russian troops leave, that would have not been logical. So for me, even though we can say historically what was right, you know, I guess anything would have been right because the troops left eventually. But Mazowiecki's actions were understandable to me. And I didn't agree with Professor Dudek's assessment, and I still don't agree with him.
Dziękuję bardzo, więc dwie sprawy. Najpierw do tego, o czym mówił pan minister
Also
Kowalec.
Two issues to respond to Minister Kowalec. The truth is that on February 10th, 1990, in the Pravda, so the main Soviet organ, a press organ, an article was published, or an announcement, saying that the Soviet government is conducting negotiations with the government of Czechoslovakia and the government of Hungary on the withdrawal of Soviet troops from their territories, and they are ready to undertake such negotiations with other countries that are interested. And that was opening the door. I think it was a mistake not to put a foot in that door. The fact that everything ended happily for us in the end, that's all true. However, between February 1990, when this announcement was published, and September 1990, when Tadeusz Mazowiecki's government sent a diplomatic note to Moscow saying that they want to start negotiations on that issue, in that meantime, the situation changed in relations between Soviet and East German relations. The negotiations regarding the reunification in Germany. In February, when the Kremlin announced that they would deign talk to other countries about withdrawing their troops from their territory, there was no agreement as yet between Kohl and Gorbachev on the removal of Soviet troops from East Germany and United Germany's membership in NATO. It all happened between February or, well, September or essentially July 1990. So, when at the end of 1990 negotiations did start, that could have started in March 1990, and the Polish side asked the Soviet delegation what they saw, how they saw the removal of Soviet troops from Poland, at what date. The first Soviet declaration went as follows. In 1994, we will finish the evacuation of our troops from the territory of United Germany, so former East Germany, at which point we will be able to start evacuating our troops from your territory. Of course, the Polish side rejected this. What I'm aiming at is that our negotiating conditions were much worse because Moscow had agreed to remove 300,000 of its troops from Germany. And that is the essence of Mazowiecki's mistake, which happily ended well for us. However, I don't think it's defensible. That is my opinion, and that's where we differ, Mr. Kowalec. But everything ended well, like I said. Also, to respond to what Professor Hutchins said, I fully understand the reasons why George Bush did not say this paragraph in Castle Square in the summer of 1992. However, I'm so glad that somebody did write a draft of that kind with that paragraph, because that would mean that discussions were taking place in the back rooms about maybe admitting Poland to NATO. So I'm very thankful for that, both to you and to others from American diplomacy who were trying to convince their leadership that they should be brave and push the Soviets out of this part of Europe, which was ultimately achieved. In response to the question voiced by Minister Kowalec, in my paper I quoted quotations from various sources. If I was to give a chronology, in May 1989, there were talks with the IMF delegation where an outline of the program was presented. As far as I know, it didn't survive in full. However, it was discussed in the minutes from the talks between the Ministry of Finance delegation and the IMF delegation, and I quoted some things from those minutes. The conversation was more or less as follows. Wróblewski was explaining the nature of the changes that were planned, so conceptual work was underway at the time. However, the problem is that nobody disclosed this to the public or publicly. There were binding the roundtable agreements were binding. The things prepared by the Ministry of Finance went counter to that, and Rakowski's government were aware that they shouldn't disclose this before the June 4th elections because it would harm them. They were planning to disclose this after Jaruzelski was appointed president by parliament, but because of the parliamentary presidential crisis, this vote kept getting deferred. Then Kiszczak was proposed as an alternative, so the thinking was it's not the right time yet. However, it's also important that when Bush came to Poland in July 1989, both Jaruzelski and Rakowski during talks with him are speaking that language in which they say they accept that the reforms will be painful for society. Rakowski talks about privatization and that it's going to not be well received by Polish society. A lot of Poles will become impoverished, and paraphrasing, he said that we would create businesses, and some people who had been in companies before they would grow rich, and that would not be well seen, but that is the price we have to pay to build a new economy, Rakowski says. So he makes these kinds of statements in those talks, but Jaruzelski doesn't shy away from similar declarations either. So Jaruzelski then makes a request to co-opt the head of the IMF and get him to speak on Polish television. I only came upon this in 1 minute, but it's not a mistake, because on another occasion Bush was talking about this to Margaret Thatcher and asking her what she thought of the idea and whether that might not be a good idea. for the reforms. Also, strictly speaking, I also cited minutes from meetings of the Council of Ministers, Rakowski's Council of Ministers, and at one of the final meetings of the government, I think this was August, documents are approved defining those reforms. When it comes to their level of detail, they're not very specific, they're not very detailed. It's not comparable to Balcerowicz's plan. As a matter of fact, we like to call these economic designs plans, like Trzeciakowski's plan or Bugaj's plan. They prepared sort of direction-setting documents, but they were not programs. A program is a cohesive whole that explains everything, that defines things. There are proposals for laws or designs or draft laws. So Rakowski's government didn't have a program. They had sort of general documents. And I will gladly draw on your expertise to discuss those documents with you if we could go through them together on an occasion.
And let me use this opportunity to add one more thing to the presentation by Professor Dudek, which is of importance to me because I focus on that matter. It's the presence of Poland in the bridge operation. Prime Minister Mazowiecki in March 1990 was in Washington to hold talks with virtually anyone at the White House, starting from President Bush, ending to the head of CIA, but he also meets Jewish organizations in the US and publicly promises that Poland would support the process of emigration of Jews from the USSR to Israel. Poland was just a stop for them. So they were leaving USSR. They landed in Warsaw. Some of them traveled by train. And then from Warsaw they flew to Tel Aviv. And it was very well received by the Department of State. Eagleberger sends a special note, a cable to command Poland and to thank Poland, which puts Mazowiecki's government in favorable light. So as a result, the relations with Israel were reinstated.
One comment and two questions. The comment is on that wonderful cable that Professor Dudek started his presentation with. It is also one of my favorite cables, and the giddiness, the almost childlike joy you can read in what is ultimately a joke cable back from Foggy Bottom to Warsaw, I think really speaks to the attitudes of the day. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention that John Davis hated that I published it in that collection. He always wanted the emphasis to be on a much more sincere note of thanks that he got from Bush and from the Secretary of State, that I think is also in there, but it's not nearly as interesting, right? But John Davis hates that cable. But the line about a Mercedes in every driveway is fantastic, so I had to put it in. I have two questions. The first one is to Fritz and Tomek. I've never had a chance to look at IMF records, and so I was always been curious about the political pressure that Western governments were putting on the IMF in terms of how to shape the recovery program. And so I was curious how independent the IMF was working and how much pressure they were under to have a particular shape to that recovery program. So, like, if Bush was saying, well, we'll do, you know, you'll get money after we get the IMF program, and then behind them they're saying, the IMF program has to look like this, this, and this, and you've got to really stick it to the polls to make sure it's a hard program. I was always curious about that discussion. So if you could elaborate on that, that would be wonderful. And then this may not be an appropriate forum to answer this question, but I'm really interested to hear from both Professor Dudek and Professor Górski about the state of declassification for the Mazowiecki government and afterwards, the archival access that you guys have, not seeing the papers, no formal papers, I don't see any footnotes. And so I'm curious what resources you're relying on and the openness of the post-89, post-90 period in government records. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Greg. It's a very important question, obviously, and a difficult one to track down in IMF records themselves, because the executive board has some records, but communications between executive board officials and the U.S. Treasury probably would have been over the phone or in person and are not written. It's not a regular documentary trail that you can trace. I do think, though, in general, at least at this particular point, and I didn't know about this instance of Jaruzelski asking about for the IMF director to come, so that's a very telling moment. But in this particular instance, and I think across the region, part of the debate happening in the U.S. government in the spring of 1989 is, should Eastern Europe get special treatment financially, because these are extraordinary circumstances. And the Treasury Department is basically saying no, because if we give Eastern Europe special treatment, we will also then be asked by the Latin Americans for why don't we get a similar kind of treatment. And so their line over and over again is that we have to basically let the IMF do what it does and set its own program. And so at least in this early period, 89, 90, I don't have any record of any particular change that the United States government asked for. I think by the time you get into the 1990s, and particularly once you start to get into the case of Russia in particular, I don't know so much about Poland in that case, then some of the conditionality starts to be softened as the political actors that you're trying to support are now on your side rather than the other side. One just interesting instance of this, though, where there was a kind of loosening in a way, in Hungary, not in Poland, Hungary in the fall of 1988, I believe it was, finally comes clean that they've been lying about the size of their sovereign debt, both to their own, I mean, they didn't tell their own people, but also to the world community. And this is a major violation of IMF rules. And under normal circumstances, the IMF would have essentially walked away from the Hungarian government. But in this instance, the U.S. government doesn't force them to change their conditionality, but says basically you can't walk away. You have to stay involved in Hungary in some fashion. And I think something similar would have happened in Poland if things had really turned south in a financial sense. The U.S. government would have prevented the IMF from completely walking away, but they weren't going to say, you should start changing the specific conditions that you're setting for the Polish program, at least as far as I can tell.
Ja nie widziałem żadnych śladów.
I haven't seen any documents proving that the executives of the International Monetary Fund have held talks with the White House or vice versa. But I can say something else, referring to what Fritz has said. The White House or the Department of Treasury has had two main fears. The first one, if you give priority, special privilege to Poland, so Latin America, who was deep in debt, would have requested the same treatment. And the second question, which have dominated the discussion in the 1980s, was the fiasco of the policy in 1970s when money was lended without any control over its use, and then the countries went bankrupt, which generated political and economic problems for individual economies and banks. However, we can see a noticeable change. Without my notes, I cannot tell you exactly, but it was around the period after June 1989, but before the formation of Mazowiecki's government, when even James Baker, who used to say that you should keep the eye on our money and be careful without sending each dollar to Poland, it's time to stop Poles of going from IMF to Paris Club and back. We need to give a clear signal that IMF should start more intensive work and maybe agree to the request of Poles. I do not have much knowledge about the situation in the IMF, but from what I have read, the documents I have read, I can tell that the experts of IMF were very pleased with the direction of changes declared by Balcerowicz. So they said this was a model reform program, but they feared whether Polish society would agree to the cost of this reform. So maybe we should tell Balcerowicz that his program was too ambitious, and if he carries it out, the social public protest will just throw the government. So experts were pondering whether you should follow the doctrine, or maybe you should convince Balcerowicz that you need some slowing down of the reforms in order to protect the society. But this is all I can tell, because these documents, yes, I did access the documents from the second half of 1989. So let me answer this question of Professor Domber of the access to the archival materials. In Poland, law provides for 30 years of documents being classified. So documents produced until 1993 should be made public, but after 1993 they should be classified. But in practice we are less consistent, and it depends on the policy of a given institution which has these documents. So I can tell you specifically that, to the best of my knowledge, the largest collection of the documents of Polish government is held in the archive of new files, and these are mainly minutes from the meetings of the government. So these are recordings of the meetings of the government, and these documents are available freely until 96 including. So it is much longer than the archival limitation. So I believe this is great material for the historians, but some parts of these meetings were excluded from recording. So when the meeting was the part of the meeting was made classified, so obviously it was the discussion about foreign policy, sometimes about the defense or secret service. But from my observation, and to prove it is the quotation that I have given to you. So there are some statements by Prime Minister Mazowiecki and other ministers concerning foreign policy when these meetings were not classified, and we can hear very interesting comments. Some of them I quote in my book. entitled From Mazowiecki to Suchocka, and I have presented the findings from this book here during this meeting. So these are the documents that are available in Poland. Moreover, some ministries make some documents public, for example, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But it's just, there is no procedure for it. So the largest collection is the Archiwum Akt Nowych, so the archive of new files. Obviously, not only recordings of the meetings or minutes, but also hundreds and thousands of annexes, so the drafts, bills, etc. So these documents are really extensive. So this is something for really curious, because it is hundreds of thousands of pages, because each meeting of the government resulted in a transcript of several hundred of pages, because Mazowiecki's government meetings lasted for more than 10 hours. Thank you.
Ja tu z mojej strony dodam jeszcze tylko takie osobiste.
Let me add one thing for my part, one personal experience. It so happens that
w momencie, kiedy jeszcze nie był formalnie powołany rząd Jana Krzysztofa Bieleckiego,
Bielecki's government was not formally formed yet. Different measures were already being taken to install that government. I had an opportunity to speak to Mr. Żabiński before he became the head of the Council of Ministers. I spoke to him at the Office for the Council of Ministers, and I took part over many months in what was happening with regard to that government. This was happening until June '91, and later on the same with the next government, including Minister Włodarczyk. I started that mission, and I had opportunities to observe things. I remember some things. I can't disclose everything, but I could verify certain events, whether based on documents or otherwise. But there were also very extensive statements by the actors in those events, interviews, televised or newspaper. That's another element. Ladies and gentlemen, so we have landed, I believe. We are concluding this panel. Please be patient with us for just another moment. First of all, I would like to thank the panelists for their papers. I would like to thank everybody for the discussion. I think we can reward our panelists with a round of applause. At this point, we will be wrapping up the online transmission of our conference, so I'd like to thank all those who have followed us online today, or those who shall be watching it at a later time. I'm very thankful for your presence. So we are concluding the transmission, the broadcast, but our meeting isn't over yet, because I'd like to ask for a conclusion. I'd like to ask Professor Karol Polejowski to deliver a few words. He is the Deputy Chairman of the Institute of National Remembrance.
At some point, do we have for the trans?
Yes. Big thanks to the translators.
Job.
Szanowni Państwo,
ladies and gentlemen, so as this conference draws to an end, please allow me to sum up what was said today, what we took part in. So this glance after 30 years at the events of early June 1989. Professor Patryk Pleskot, in his presentation, in his paper, referred to a speech by President Reagan on December 23rd, 1981. And in that speech to the American people, the American president also made broad references to the situation in Poland, the introduction of martial law and the mass repressions that affected the opposition and members of the Solidarity movement. And in that speech, President Reagan said something that is a good summary of his understanding of who the Poles are. So President Reagan said that Poland has the most wonderful tradition of not consenting to enslavement. So in other words, President Reagan pointed to a trait that the Poles had both in the 19th century under the partitions and in the 20th century during World War II and the German occupation, and then during the period of communist enslavement. So the Poles' love of freedom, which was there throughout history and continues to be there, and I think that Ronald Reagan understood this trait very well. I also believe that the American people understand this trait extremely well. The citizens of the free and powerful United States of America. And I think that also sheds light on why the Americans and the Poles have worked so well together, as seen also during today's conference, in what we heard today, and to our young guests from Texas, from the States. I hope it will also help you understand why Americans and Poles can understand each other so well. Another thing is that this conference was devised as a comparison of two spheres, two areas. On the one hand, we have participation from those who were participants in the events of the late 80s and early 90s, ambassadors, professors, ministers. On the other hand, we have here historians who were either witnesses of those events, or because of their age, they are today researching those events through documents and trying to arrive at the truth. Because historical research, what's most important in historical research is the truth and striving for the truth. So although this conference was broadcast and a recording will be available online on the IPN's online channels, it may be worth reflecting, and this is an appeal and a request to the organizers, whether we might not come up with some kind of publication that would collect the papers delivered today, the thoughts announced today, perhaps in an expanded form, because there was no time today to say everything, and such a publication on the Polish transition and the position of the United States, but also the earlier period of solidarity and martial law. It would be well to make a publication, and that is something to be thought about by the organizers and participants. So on behalf of the chairman of the Institute of National Remembrance, Dr. Karol Nawrocki, I would like to warmly thank our guests, the panelists, the participants of this conference for coming to Warsaw, for sharing both their experiences and their knowledge, their expertise, their findings I would like to thank you as well, representatives of Young America, students of Texas A&M University, for your presence. I hope that this encounter with Polish American history has been a kind of lesson for you and has given you a better understanding of who Poles are. And using this opportunity, I would like to once again thank the organizers. So the office, the IPN Office for Historical Research, Dr. Sebastian Pilarski, Director Joanna Górkiewicz, but first and foremost, Dr. Tomasz Kozłowski, who came up with the idea for this conference and has taken it under his wing. Also Sylwia Schütz for her involvement. Ladies and gentlemen, I think that Tomasz Kozłowski deserves applause and a word of thanks. Ladies and gentlemen, that marks the end of our conference. Once more, thank you for your presence, for being here, and for this event. And to the young Americans, representatives of Texas, I wish you a good stay in Poland. Thank you very much.